This is a few of the ideas from my kind of allotment sketchbook. Um, Different methods of growing using reclaimed materials and lots of composting and composting in general. So what I've got here, it's quite hard to see from this. I've got some annotations on there, but I'll just talk through it. This level here is the pre-existing ground level, so that's or it could be a raised bed. So what I've shown here, this is a raised bed side, which is a scaffold board. So I've dug the trench down just about half the depth of the container, probably about a foot on this case. And then I've got another 200 millimeters there for the raised bed. And then the material I dig out here, which is can be fairly rough topsoil, which is added to the raised bed, so that raises up the level here, and then it gives you the increased depth on the path or the worm bed. So what I'm doing here, this is another scaffold board. So rather than having a path, just wood chip, which kind of wastes a bit of space and you can't really grow it, and it's not really sort of doing a huge amount, I thought I'd make the most of the space by having underpath wormeries, and these are 25 litre HDPE containers from a car wash. For their detergent is delivered in those, so they have a number of those every week. It's single-use plastic, so it's HDPE, so it can be recycled, but I like to reuse those. And the nice thing about having those under the path is the plastic is protected from ultraviolet, so it's the ultraviolet light that deplasticizes material, makes the plastic go brittle, makes it kind of break up. So having those isolated from ultraviolet really prolongs their life. They're food grade as well, so if you've got to worry about plastics or plasticides leaching out from the plastic as material breaks down in those. So what I'm doing here, underpath wormeries, 25 litre HP containers. I just showed a layer of wood chip to supplement the drainage in there a little bit. And obviously the wood chip will break down as well. With these containers, they will settle down, but what I do is I put a top sort of feed on there, and then all the native worms can come in, and they do, and then they break that material down. So I'm just showing there scaffold board path, scaffold boards for the raised bed, and then that just shows the raised bed. So you're not digging out all that material, you're digging out some of the material, and then you're building up the raised beds on the side as well. So whatever material you dig out there increases the height above the water table on the raised bed. You work in organic matter, so it will retain moisture as well. And any additional depth here actually works as a sort of drainage channel as well. So it's quite a nice system, and you can get a huge amount of volume just in that, even a foot wide path. So you don't lose any kind of growing space. And when large plants are growing in there, they'll put roots down, and they'll root into there, and then fungi and the hyphae will kind of in return they'll extend the root zone of the plants as well. And then when you harvest that material, all the worms in there and all the cocoons will go straight onto the bed. What I normally do is cover it up with a cloche. So initially the worms got a chance to move back down, so they're not being predated by birds straight away. But obviously they're much more safer in here from predation, so you can have really huge populations of worms as well. So it's a really good system. I've seen these as well, not these containers, but soil feeding stations, where you actually have the soil feeding station in the bed, but then you lose the grow space. So I thought it makes sense to have all the feeding stations together under the path, so you can have an 8 foot long feeding station, and then you've got masses of volume and masses of amounts of worm casts and resulting compost. So what I'm showing here, I've just showed green just to sort of show the organic matter. This is part composted material, so it's all the kind of stuff that goes into one of the dalek compost bins. Rather than turning that, what I do is let it initially hot compost, and then when that heat's died down, worms will already start being moving in. So then you just put that straight into these containers. And I'm just showing it here. As the level reduces over time, you've got a lot of empty space in those containers. So in the third sketch here, I'm just showing these are all about third full, so I'm moving those along, filling up the one on the end, so that's the aged material. And then I'd start again with these ones with fresh material, and work from maybe left to right as you work across, so you know the one on the end, and you can see it visibly. It will be really very like almost like peat. It would be really dark, and you can, if you just put your hand in and feel through, you can feel the worm casts because they're like almost like little tiny little round sort of balls, just sort of like a sort of peating material. And I just said material from part empty containers combined into one container. Empty containers are filled with part composted material. So yeah, so it's just a cycles through. So it's quite nice. Is unlike a dalek compost bin where it settles down and then you put new material into that bin. You're not mixing old material and new material when you're adding it. So the next page here, I've just showed one of these aerating tools for turning compost bins. I think I bought one from Primrose Garden Products. It's got two little twisted bits of metal on the ends, and there's like a little step tab on there, so it won't. When you push that into the ground, these flip back, and then when you pull it out, they'll latch down again, but they'll just stick out 90 degrees, so they're perpendicular, and then that pulls up a kind of wedge of material, and then you can aerate and you can mix material. I'm really just pre-composting material and then using vermicompost, so the worms are actually moving the material and they'll cycle around masses of material. So whatever worm casts they produce is taking material somewhere else to consume that material. So they're really constantly redistributing material constantly, sort of 24 hours a day almost. What I've shown here, this is a wall barn M tray. It's a Greenroof planter, but I had one of these dalek compost bins. These are available from the council's Get Composting scheme. They're subsidised, so they're only £10 each. They're really effective. I tend to use the larger ones, which are about 330 litres. The smaller ones 220, but I like the extra volume in here. What I'm showing on here is spent brewer's waste, aged wood chip, so it's wood chip that's been in a pile or sacks outside, kitchen waste, garden waste, leaves, and then biochar as well. So I'm adding about 30 litres of biochar to each 330 litre container. I'm showing it in layers, but the layers gives you an idea of having a sufficient ratio of carbon material and nitrogen. So the carbons is all in the leaves, and then the nitrogen is in the kind of green waste, but green kitchen waste, coffee grinds, brewer's waste. So it's a sort of tends to be the wetter materials, and the browns are sort of things like shredded card paper, brown leaves. So all the autumn leaf, freshly fallen leaves, they'll go in there as well. Yeah, so what I've shown here, the scale is all a bit wrong, but this is a plastic pallet. It's interesting. These are, I think they're high density polyethylene again, so it's one of those materials that can be recycled over and over. Life cycle of a single-use timber pallet is actually more damaging for the environment than these plastic pallets. It seems a bit strange to me, but obviously there's lots of transportation involved in preparing woods and machining woods and transporting those, because they're obviously not grown locally. These plastic pallets, they're quite lightweight. They can be stacked, they can be transported, they can be shipped, they can be ground up in a kind of almost like a giant kind of compost shredder, turned back into sort of plastic chips, and then they can go back into an injection molding machine and be reused. So they can be reused, not much sure how many times, but they're one of these plastics that can be recycled over and over. But what I'm showing here, I like to level up an area for composting using these pallets, because it creates an immediate deck, infill with wood chip, so immediately you've got another 6 inches of organic matter. The plastic pallet again partially filled in with wood chip, and then I use a weld wire galvanized mesh, which has got about 10 millimeter opening, and then I think this is about 1.2 millimeters, so it's much heavier duty than chicken wire. And what I'll do is I'll put maybe old fence posts or something like that, and then I'll bend that wire down so it makes that completely rodent proof. when you turn the compost bin as well, because that material's mixed and it's adding in batches, that will heat up to easily 60, 65, 70 degrees Celsius. So it'd be way too hot for rat to be anywhere near there. They might walk over the top, but they'll soon vacate, because it's going to basically cook them alive if they stick around. I fill these Daleks right up to the top, and one of them was missing a lid, and I just repurposed some buffalo board from a scaffold yard, and I put an aeration fitting, a stainless steel soffit vent in there, and I had this wall barn M tray on top. And what I noticed, the plants in that tray were absolutely thriving, and the compost, rather than being compacted, it was just like peat. It was really friable, really nice material, really held moisture well, it drained well as well. Plants were really doing well. And underneath, there's like the square sort of upstands on it, and there's like a sort of grid sort of pattern. And on top of this compost bin, it was all lines of worm casts in the same pattern. So the worms had climbed up through that little soffit vent into the planter, and they're working between the planter and circulating castings and aerating the compost and breaking down that material, and also benefiting all the fungi in there for all the sort of microbes in the worm castings. So it just goes to show that plants really thrive on part composted material. There's always this thing about, oh, compost's got to be mature and it's got to be aged, but all the soil life is in that organic matter as it's breaking down, and it's that soil life that's feeding the plants. So compost isn't a fertilizer. Compost is something that feeds the soil, and the soil life break down the carbon and the nitrogen and the nitrates and all the kind of minerals and whatever elements are actually in those plants, and then they make those available for plant roots to take up, and for microbes and the worms and to fungi to make those available for plants. Then the plant roots in turn benefit the fungi. So yeah, it's a whole ecosystem that's going round. And what is quite interesting as well, we've got an established ecosystem with the plants in whatever organic matter is broken down in there. That layer, or the transition between that aged material and the part composted material, is really where all that life cycle is really going on. Obviously down further in the bin, then you've got more of the as this breaks down, you'll have more lobworms will tunnel up and they'll work it around and that material. But it's really that top foot where there's lots of air and there's so much soil life in there. That's really where it's breaking down really fast. Further down in the pile, it's a slower kind of burn in a way, but yeah, because you've got so much movement and so much air, that material breaks down really fast. Even in a couple of weeks, it's quite impressive. And what I'm doing now is using these trays on top of hot composting bins, and even though you've got huge amounts of heat down in that pile, you'll get heat loss through here, and then you'll get lots of water vapor and carbon dioxide, and that water vapor is actually sort of permeating through that soil, and you've got increased levels of carbon dioxide as well. So if you can kind of combine that with a plastic cloche or something like that, you've got a little microclimate going on actually in that layer on top of the compost. So I think it's something I want to kind of do a bit more work with, but so far the results have been quite stark, even just after a couple of weeks, just observing how the plants are benefiting. So I said fill with wood chip. Yeah, so it just basically gives you another a foot of wood chip, and it makes a lovely level area to compost. And when you've got that galvanized weld wire mesh on top, when you empty the bin, you can just sweep that straight off, and it's nice and flat, and you've got all that soil life to make contact with all the material in there, so that will break down really well. I was just showing, this is like a kind of grow tower, and I had the idea was I'd have 25 litre containers sort of stacked, so I'd have reservoirs, worm soil feeding stations, another reservoir, and then another sort of soil feeding station. So you can fill these up through the top. I'll probably have a pipe there to fill it up, and then you've got capillary material here which would wick moisture out into the surrounding container. And on this container, I haven't shown it here, but there'd be drilled holes, maybe 50 millimeters diameter, and they'd be like plant pockets for vertical planting, so it's a vertical kind of grow tower. But on here, I'm just showing a record sort of mechanics vise there, and this was really for my own use, so I can kind of replicate those. So I know the distance to bend these up stands, and it just shows how far down in the vise it is. I've got 60 millimeters there, and I'm bending that over 90 degrees to make a tab that's bent back on itself. And then yeah, that just gives me the idea where I can get those bends in. So I'm bending it around a bit of upstanding 6 millimeter bar to give you this sort of loop. And then on here it just shows you that tab there, so that supports the weight of the reservoir and then any subsequent soil feeding stations as well. With the soil feeding stations, the material will break down over time. These are designed to sort of stack, so they're quite close fitting. So if you've got a little weight on there, that will tend to distort the lower container. So it's important to have those little tabs there. The lower reservoir can actually be filled with blocks of off-cut fence post or any kind of logs or something like that. So it will support that material for, really all I'm interested in is supports it for a year, and then I can kind of harvest that material. And these are nice because you can actually lift those containers out and then you can maintain them. If this was in a complete 45-gallon barrel, obviously the one at the base will be quite awkward to empty, but you're only doing that once a year, if that. And my idea really is that you're adding organic matter, and you're harvesting plants, you're cutting plants back, you're allowing roots to die back in the soil, so you're replenishing the compost, so it's not kind of stagnating and having all the life taken out. So you're putting really more back than what you're removing, so you're creating that really good growing sort of habitat. So let's turn the page. I'm not sure what we've got next. This just shows quite a nice way, quite an easy way of making a little shelf for a cold frame, just using a bit of aluminium angle. Just holes drilled here, so it's 4.5 millimeter hole, an ordinary stainless steel wood screw, a sort of heavy duty raw plug, and I think this is 10 millimeters, so I'm using an 8 millimeter plug, and this is pushes in here. You put the screws in, and that expands the raw plug, and it just holds your little tubular shelf in. So it's a lightweight shelf for little seed trays and things like that. That was just an idea for how to build cold frames onto the side of a polytunnel. So in effect, it makes more of an earth sheltered greenhouse, and then use the north facing side as a sort of thermal mass. So solar gain heats that material here, so you could use rainwater harvesting, water butts, or even compost. So you could put compost here, and then the heat will extend into that tunnel, and obviously you're extending the area there which is exposed to the sun, so you're heating up the ground here, you're heating up the soil here, and yeah, you're really maximizing the usable kind of grow space. And so if you have seeds in here, you could start them off in here, and then you can move them into the tunnel, and then during the growing season, any of the cold frame lids could just be put to one side, and then as you move into autumn or winter, then you put the lids back, and then you can extend the season that way. Also, if you're using a polytunnel, I think the ends of it could be boarded in or just sheeted in rigid plastic, and then I'm just trying to reduce the amounts of plastics, and so what I was thinking of here is doing away with all the plastic on that side and just having that as a raised bed. And because the soil level is up here, then the area that's sort of shaded, if you imagine the angle of the sun, it's only going to be a little tiny amount rather than a great big triangular section from if that was at the ground level. So I think the other thing as well, in terms of wind loading as well, it's much more aerodynamic, so it's not going to be battered around in the wind, so it's going to be less likely to tear and damage. And obviously you could use a better quality of polytunnel material, and that could just be just PVC, clear PVC, or reclaimed acrylic sheet from the laser cutters where I source materials for the cloches and things like that. So you're not using lots of virgin grade plastics. You're using plastics that's already destined for recycling, so it's being reused, which is much more sustainable as well. So I just showed there, that's sort of north facing side. What have I showed there? Existing polytunnel, reclaimed acrylic there, guttering on here, so you're harvesting all that rainfall from here, and then that could go into water butts as well, or capillary trays, so you've got self sort of watering as well, and you can regulate the capillary trays as well. So the sort of cold frame polytunnel. So it's a kind of almost based on the Victorian sort of idea of like something like a melon house, where the greenhouse is sunk below the ground level, so you've only got a small, very low profile greenhouse with steps going down into it. But then I'm combining it with almost like a pineapple house, where you've got that would be manure piles and things like that, and you'd have bricks here with holes in it, and then you'd stoke material into that, and that would heat the greenhouse. But I'm just using solar gain there to just extend. I mean, that really does extend the floor area of the greenhouse massively, and especially with sloping sides, because you're not losing out anything there. And if this is a part of the cold frame, you could just have agricultural mesh here, or we could even do away with that, so plants can be planted right from here to here, and if they're in capillary trays, then it could just be easily moved over. So that would be really quite effective, I think. I quite enjoy the idea of the earth sheltered greenhouse, because you're just using earth rather than building materials. So here I'm just showing, this is a galvanized cold water tank from a loft, just been repurposed as an instant raised bed. But again, I'm showing those soil feeding stations, wicking containers, capillary matting to create that extended sort of irrigation system. So you've got a reservoir in there, so when you water it, it stores all that water. You don't just get lots of runoff, and you're not washing out nutrients from the soil, because it's all going back down into the soil feeding station. So that's being cycled by all the worm activity. And then this container here, you could even stand pots on it and use it as a nursery bed, and so that would be like a wicking tray as well. And I'd use biochar in there and charcoal, so you'd have loads of worm activity and soil life, and when you stand the pots on there, the worms will be moving between here and the actual pot plant as well. So that makes a really seamless transition between the compost in the pot and that nice moist environment here, so it really wicks well into that pot. And the idea of having these with the wicking sort of wings coming out, when you water that planter, you're cycling that irrigation into the surrounding planter as well. So the pot plants here, they'll benefit from being watered, and I tend to use rainwater as well, because otherwise you're just basically pouring chlorinated water on, and which can kill fungi and whatever sort of soil life in there. So it's not really something you want to use. So if I'm using mains water, I tend to fill up a plunge tank first and let any chlorine sort of off gas before I'm pouring it into the soil. But the idea is that irrigation is being used, and then you're replenishing that. It's not the same water that's allowed to stagnate in there. And also then you have a sort of a dry period, and then that pot isn't standing in water. But with capillary action, if you've got aerated soil, it's only the sort of spaces in between the soil where it's actually wicking moisture, so it's not going to become completely saturated. And that's why you have sort of soil structure, and that's why you really want to encourage soil life. So here, this is just a green roof on a garden store or shed, and I'm showing, once again, it's one of these 25 litre containers. But here I'm just showing the base of it is used as a planter itself. So that's a little planter, a bit like a kind of seed tray really. It's just a nice little size to plant up. The middle section is a very short soil feeding station, so that's a collar. I probably should have shown a line here just to show that it hasn't actually got a base in it. That's just like a ring here, and then that's that bit here, and then the other one here, that's cut off, and then that's inverted. It really does the same thing as the base of the container. So you get two of these planters, which are really useful planters. They're you can have them at whatever depth you'd like. So it's a nice deep container, same depth as a flower pot, but a nice area as well. So you can use those as capillary trays, as in the previous drawing. So you could stand maybe six 90mm pots in one of those, and it just stops them falling over. And if you've got a thin layer of biochar and wood chip in there, then that becomes a really excellent as a capillary wick. You can stand it onto a reservoir, but in this case I'm using a soil feeding station. So that might only be 100mm depth of substrate on a green roof, and you might be growing succulents or meadow plants or whatever, or clovers or just wildflowers or whatever. But the idea was here you can just lift that container, put kitchen scraps, kitchen waste in there, shredded newspaper. When you get junk mail, the window envelopes, you can tear the windows out and just shred up the envelopes and pop them in there. It's just a really quick way, a really convenient way of getting rid of organic matter and then turning that back into a usable source of compost or worm casting, so you can use that material. What I've shown here is just offcuts of wood, but what I have found is, because I live near sort of Epping Forest, I've been picking up part compost or part rotten logs, which you can actually stack, and that makes a really nice support for the planter. But because you've already got fungi growing on those logs, they're in proximity to that wet kitchen waste, and then the fungi and the mycelium, it really benefits really fast. It really sort of growth is almost sort of exponential. So you have loads of soil life in there, and it's terrific for the worms and also for creating that sort of capillary action between any planters on there as well. So the plants in here will benefit, and then the surrounding soil will benefit as well. So on a green roof, normally that soil's there for the life of the green roof. You don't really want to climb up on there and dig it all out and disturb your established plants. So by having a soil feeding station, is you're feeding those plants, you're adding organic matter, and you're adding nutrients and elements back into that soil, which are being used up by the growing cycle of the plants. So all I've shown here, this is just a roll of chicken wire, and I've got a bit of a weed suppressant membrane, which I use as a sort of filter. This shows a beautiful rubber liner lipping down here, and then I've got a bit of builder's flash band here as well. So that makes like a kind of almost like a drip molding here. But having the soil feeding station really helps sort of capture that rainwater, so it stops it from running off. And on a green roof as well, because these are normally quite sunny locations where you're growing things like succulents, that top layer can become quite dry and quite compacted. So it's so nice to have these soil feeding stations in there, because when it rains, the water will just permeate through and it'll soak into any cardboard and leaves and material you've got on there, and it'll stop it just running straight down the gutters. The other thing as well, if you do fit a gutter, it'd be nice to capture that rainwater and any additional irrigation on there. So if you've got any runoff through those soil feeding station, those wormeries, you're capturing that, and then you can use that straight back on the plants again. The nice thing about these as soil feeding stations, rather than a wormery with a sump that captures leachate, any leachate will kind of be absorbed into the surrounding compost, or it will go into that gutter, but then it can be used, so you could pour that over to a log pile or a pile of wood chip or something like that, which will help that material to break down. And I think the next page is just an extension of, let's slightly out of order here. Oh, what I was showing here, it's quite faint. I was just penciling something in. I'm not sure what material to use, but I was thinking about making an air pot. So what happens, it's got permeable, well, it's just got holes in that sheet material, and then it's got still links here, so you could kind of clip itself together to make a little cylinder, plant plants into it, and if you want to transplant those, you could open up those little clips and then just take the plant out on the root ball. But the idea of here is, as the roots grow up to the edge of the pot, If that was a conventional pot, the roots would turn around and they start growing round and it gets sort of root bound or pot bound. And then when you plant, you've got to break the roots to sort of encourage them to grow sort of outwards again. Otherwise, they tend to grow around in a circle, and the plant can be quite unstable as well if it's a tree or a shrub. But it just means it takes a little bit longer to get established. But what I was thinking of doing here is once the roots get up to that air there, they won't grow through it. They'll sort of stop where they are because there isn't really anywhere to go. So what happens here is I was thinking you can either plant that straight in the compost, and then roots will grow through this into the surrounding compost. So you haven't got to disturb the plant. Alternatively, you could just unclip those and then pop it straight in. So I'm trying to find ideally a laser cutter material using a reclaimed sort of plastic, but I might just make these out of PET would probably work, but I don't know. I'd really want bigger sheets, but even HDPE, I could probably cut sections out from the 25 litre containers, but then it's finding a way of getting those flat so you can either route it out. I think what you could do is you could make a jig and a sort of template, so you could just make a number of those and then make them all the same. I think that'd be quite neat. HDPE black, HDPE with the carbon black additive, so it's ultraviolet, it's sort of UV stabilized, would be nice. So here is a friend was keeping chickens, and of what I've shown here, this is the chicken run itself. And I've shown using scaffold boards and ripped down the centre to make two sort of trays. So what I was thinking of doing here is having the lower tray with a layer of 10mm wire mesh, having that. I'm just trying to think what the best way of doing this. I'm sort of evolving this idea really. So what I wanted to do is lift up the run, so it's like a kind of chicken sort of tractor thing, so you can move that somewhere else. Then I'd have a tray or a framework inside with that mesh on it. So what I do is here, all the that would be the fresher sort of material I'd sweep off, and that will settle down over time. But then I wanted to have a soil feeding station here alongside the chicken run, so you've got masses of worms in here, and then they'd be moving into the run underneath that layer of mesh. So the chickens would be active on top and they'd be digging around, but they wouldn't be able to dig down any further than that mesh. But they wouldn't be walking on the mesh because you'd have that nice layer of fresh wood chip on there as well. But it just means that the majority of the worms are going to be in this older material here. So then the worms aren't just going to get eaten by the chickens when they're digging down. And then when the chicken manure is sort of washed in here, it sort of permeates down, and then it's consumed by the worms. And so the idea is it kind of keeps the run clean, but it also subdivides that material, so you're not just adding fresh wood chip into the old compost. So I don't know, after 3-6 months you might empty that out completely and then take the casts out and move those casts onto a raised bed, take out the part or the older chicken run bedding from the top layer, put it into the bottom layer, and then just cycle it around. But I wanted to have this soil feeding station here, so you can have a big sort of almost like a safe zone for the worms to go. So when they're active in here, then you can fill that up for a sort of soil feeding station. And I wanted to have plants in here as well, so you've got things like comfrey and clover and alfalfa, so the chickens are eating the plants, and then the plants are benefiting from the as when the chickens dig, they'll push mulch onto there as well. So it's really literally cycling straight round like that, obviously with adding in fresh wood chip here, and then that's sort of replacing what you're losing with the growth from the plants that's being eaten by the chickens. So yeah, I like those containers because they're free. I mean, you could buy some sort of tray or whatever, but then it would cost, I don't know, 20-30 quid, and you'd be more reluctant to start drilling holes in and playing around. But I think if you can source got a continual source of some sort of materials, it's so nice to be able to experiment with that and then develop. And I've made these capillary reservoirs and different things, and using the containers, and then found a better way of doing it. But then I've been able to repurpose the containers I've already used just as soil feeding stations as well, so you're not throwing those materials away. And the single-use plastics just designed for the car wash detergent, but they can be used over and over again. And what I was showing here, this would be like for a green roof, center section of that, so it's like the soil feeding station. And I was thinking of maybe drilling holes through and then running a stainless steel bar or wire through it, and then making this as a sort of tray that would help you to contain any substrate on a green roof with a higher or a steeper pitch, really. So it's a bit like a kind of geotextile that's used by the sort of side of a motorway or something like that, but you're using that reclaimed materials to create these planting pockets. So that was the idea behind that. You might have to cut those or change the shape, really, because these are a little bit too big for that, but I think they'd still work. Even if it was quite an angle, you could just angle the substrate down, and then that would really help to kind of lock it all together. And also I found if you can subdivide a green roof when you're planting it, if this is a foot by 250 millimeters, you can sort of say, I'll put a plant here, put a plant there, 5 plants in each one, and then it's already got quite a good coverage. If you just had a big open area, it's somewhat off-putting in terms of how to plant it, and you find you've got too many plants here, not enough there, or you do the bit at the front to make it look nice, but then you haven't got enough plants for the back. So it's quite nice, and when the plants have got their own little bit of space, they'll fill in a lot faster as well. If they're overcrowded, they'll just stay the same size basically. And that's the previous one with the air pop. So this was just showing the soil feeding station in the green roof, just with a bit more detail, really. What I was doing here, which is quite nice, I think, is just I was thinking of extending the soil feeding station up higher. If you can find a few of these containers, some have got slightly different moulding on the outside, and they've got like reinforcing sort of webs or flutes moulding in the outside, and when you cut them off as the collar, the base of another container does actually nestle down in there. So what I'd like to do is have that soil feeding station going right to the top, have a little sort of U-shaped cutout here, so you can get your finger through those holes to lift up the planter. But then when you lift that planter out, it's supported by that plastic. And then round the outside, I was putting logs and bark and organic matter to make almost a little miniature hugel bed, and obviously using the part rotten logs underneath the container as well to support it. On this cross section here, I've got plywood board for the roof structure, and I've showed some of the details of the way the roof's built here. But I've shown those going across, but really you'd have them going down the angle of the pitch, otherwise these would tend to roll down. And then this is just kitchen waste and shredded cardboard as well. And then I've shown another one here, so you could have those all across the roof. But what's quite nice about these, because that container's black HDPE, when you first set that in, you might want to have it nice and level so it looks all neat. But then as the plants grow, and as the plants grow in here, you can increase the depth of that soil feeding station here, and then the plants will kind of mound up and nestle around and soften those edges. So then that gives you an increased volume for the soil feeding station part. And what I found in the bark here, especially around the edges, if you can almost sort of terrace that, and I was using vertical sticks and logs and bark, making planting pockets for succulents, and I was getting wood ears and jelly ears and elf cups and all these kind of fungi growing, because you've got that damp organic matter here, and plants were really thriving as well, because you've got a little bit of moisture to sort of keep them going between rainfall. So when there's a period of drought, they're not suffering, they're not getting stressed, they've got that little sort of buffer zone with the additional moisture in there. So this is Well, I'm really finding different uses for these containers. So this is what I call a green wall, a green roof planter, green roof tray. And I was thinking of using those across the tops of a compost bin. So you're actually growing on top of the compost bin. I think that's quite good fun. And here I'm showing these as vertical green wall planters and combining that with composting. So the compost is just sort of shaded in red here. So, and then the green parts where the plants are planted is in green. So I'm using a sort of green wall to conceal a compost bin here. What I've shown there is slightly terraced, and then there's a capillary wicking container which is set below the ground level as well. So the idea is that you just see the plants from here, and then you've got a cut down PET bottle as a water filler, and then you fill up the material there. You can observe what the water level is in there and put an upturned flower pot on top to stop any amphibians and things from falling in. And then you've got that lovely mound of greenery, but then because these are stackable, you can just remove those, and then you can harvest the compost. And I'm thinking of using, well, I'm using these containers in compost heaps because it's so much more manageable, because you're not digging out material or forking material out. You can just lift it with these containers. The nice thing about that is, as material breaks down, you can put the aged material to one side, and then you might want to replace that with fresh kind of waste. So you're not mixing old compost and new compost. So it means you don't end up with finished compost with lots of bits of fresh kitchen waste in there. And then moving over to the next page, that's what I've shown here. This would be more for the green roof planter, and I've got a much deeper container, and then I've cut out these sort of little D-shaped indents here, and then the idea is the green roof planter, or the green roof tray, nestles down in here, and then you just need to leave a little bit of compost lower here, so you can just put your finger through those on each side and then lift those up, and then you can put your kitchen waste in there. And then the idea of this, it supports the substrate, the compost around there, so when you take the container out, it doesn't fall back into the opening. This was just an extension of the idea for a sort of chicken run with that tray to subdivide the worm habitat underneath, and then the fresh wood chip for the chickens on top. But I was extending that, thinking about, I'm not quite sure how well this would work, but what I wanted to do is have a planter actually inside the chicken run, maybe under some sort of mesh, so the chickens can harvest the material. They can eat the plants, but they can't kind of kill the plant completely. I don't know how well that works, because I might find the chickens would just pull the material out completely anyway. But I thought that might be quite nice, because then as the chickens are kind of scratching around, kicking up the wood chip will go into the plant, so that kind of top it up. And obviously as their waste breaks down, and then that would in turn be taken up by the plants again, so it's cycle straight round in the run itself. But yeah, well, it obviously would work, and if this was a large chicken run, you could even have an area which you could fence off. It'd be quite nice to have maybe 3 areas, so you could have seed sort of germinating area, young plants, and then a kind of really exhausted kind of run. So as those plants are being trimmed back, then you could move them onto the next area, so then that will give those plants a bit of rest, so they could grow back, and then you could open it again. But it's just an interest, really, just to sort of show you different ways of doing these things. This is just a slightly more detailed version of what I was showing in the previous sketch with the green wall planters on the side of compost bin. So I'm showing in red here, this is where the planting pockets would be. So that's like the green wall planter part. In blue, that's the reservoir, and then in green, that would be the green roof tray on top. What I've shown here, it's just a cut down Coke can, and I've just sort of done a sort of cut through here to show there's a PVC pipe inside with a little bit of capillary wicking material. And the idea is when you water hit these, then that water will overflow through that pipe down into the next container, and then gradually down into the bottom one. And I've shown sort of Coke cans here just as a sort of subfloor just to support the weight of the container above. And on this one here, I've got to cut through again, and I'm showing there's a roll of weld wire mesh inside with corrugated cardboard wrapped around it. So that's like a soil feeding station within that vertical planter. So you can lift these off. You can put new kitchen waste in here, and then this plant here is identical to that one. So that would also have that mesh inside as a soil feeding station, and that mesh could actually be quite big. So if you can imagine the cross section or the sort of plan view of this container, it would almost be like a layer of turf around the outside, with a really large, generous soil feeding station inside. So the idea is you could push that material through to harvest it, and then put fresh cardboard and kitchen waste back in there, so you're feeding those plants. And I think that what would be quite nice is those plants would get a bit of root pruning, and then they would get the additional worm activity from the soil feeding station, or the sort of worm tower inside the green wall planter. And I've shown here is I use small holes here. It helps to lift those off, because if you imagine that's a reservoir and the water's up to this level, if you're just manhandling that, when you take it apart, it would tend to sort of overflow. And what is quite nice as well, you can actually use those as overflows as well. So when you water it, you might water it with a watering can from a plunge tank, and then the water will just run off there, run down the plants, and then it permeate down into the compost and the wood chip around the base. This one I've just shown an elbow coming out, but I'd actually have a PET bottle as a funnel. I tend to mount up wood chip or keep that at a level of ground level. So the reservoir there is just a reservoir, so it's not really adding much. So I think if you can keep this lower, then you can add more tiers to create a higher vertical planter. And I've shown these as planting pockets, but what you can do is you can actually plant directly into this container here. So you can plant along that seam there, plant into the top of the container. So you've got that seam planted here, again in the reservoir, into that top of that container, and then that seam, and then you've got loads of levels. And also you can plant through these cutouts as well, which is quite nice, because you imagine the plant will spread. It really does soften the outline of that container, makes it really quite a good sort of grow tower. But I think that's all for now. I've got a few blank pages left before I fill up this sketchbook. Yes, it's working quite well. I'm quite enjoying this, and it's a Traveller's company. Really nice paper. Really takes fountain pen ink nicely. There's my Vitruvian worm. And yeah, it's just good. I think it's nice to have something, keep all these sketches contained, rather than just bits of scraps of papers and backs of envelopes and things like that. And just spending a bit of time to add a bit of colour just makes things look a little bit, it makes it easier to explain. It makes it look a little bit more attractive as well. But it's very sort of simple ideas, but just trying to combine them in different ways, really. So quite a lengthy video, but thanks for watching. I hope you found these videos of use.